Hello, everyone. This is World Review, and I'm Ivo Daalder, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and we're back for our weekly review of what's happening in the world. And I guess this time what's happening in the United States will be once again on the top of our agenda. Joining us again is Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker. Wonderful to have you, Susan. Also joining us is Peter Spiegel, the U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times. Peter, great to have you.
Good to be back, Ivo.
And from the United Kingdom, Giles Whittell, who is the World Affairs editor of Tortoise Media. Giles, wonderful to have you as well. Susan, let's start with you. Biden won the election. He's president-elect. He is trying to put a team together and put policies in place while the outgoing president not only remains president, which he does till Inauguration Day, but denies the fact that Biden has won. And so there is very little going on in transition. How is Biden trying to deal with this? How is he trying to move forward and prepare for the day that he is in office? And what do you think we can expect from him when it comes to thinking about foreign policy?
Well, thank you so much, Ivo. It really is. I think in a way, because we're all still so immersed in it, we should take a second to recognize what extraordinary and really, unsettling and disturbing week in America this has been. It's certainly true that President Trump threatened before the election not to recognize, except for one that had him as the winner. But I think it's still worth, taking a pause and reflecting on the fact that we have a situation here that's more familiar my foreign correspondent days in Minsk or Kiev than it is in Washington, D.C., where the president of the United States is pulled up in the White House refusing, that's our friend Ellie. She has some views about the president, as you can tell. Look, he's holed up in the White House, refusing to recognize the election results, and amazingly enough, has continued to bring the Republican Party with him, so that you asked about Joe Biden. Joe Biden is in Wilmington, Delaware, fielding calls from world leaders in an ad hoc fashion because the president has refused to allow the State Department to assist in this transition. Joe Biden has spoken to more world leaders than members of the Republican Party, recognizing him as the president-elect of the United States. Overnight, China belatedly joined in on this, making Vladimir Putin basically the lone major power holdout, along with Brazil and Mexico in this hemisphere. Other than that, even staunch Trump allies like Bibi Netanyahu in Israel have recognized Biden's victory. And so, again, we undermine, it seems to me, in every possible way, American democracy, both internationally as well as, of course, domestically, with this spectacle. And, that's even assuming that Trump leaves office on January 20th. And, I don't know about you, I've sort of veered in every which direction this week, from, complete panic and fear to, listening to these kind of off the record assurances from Republicans that somehow they're just humoring Donald Trump and, don't worry, they understand it's over, which, by the way, may well be true, but is one of the most taking cynical and destructive acts toward our democracy I've ever seen. So, I'll more or less leave it at that. As far as Biden goes, I think we've talked a lot on this program before, and I've seen nothing to change my mind about it. He has an extremely experienced cadre of foreign policy and national security advisors. They rolled out their transition teams for the departments this week. I know, as I'm sure everyone on this call does, a number of those officials, they're good, smart, steady people who might actually do the work of government. This is a week, after all, when the president also fired the defense secretary and several of the top advisors, replacing them with junior level unqualified ideologues, and we still have no true indication of what is the agenda of this. Is it pure vengeance or something more sinister? We don't even know that yet. So again, I'll leave it there, but mainly I'm reflecting at the end of this long week on a terrible week for America.
Well, just to add to that, Susan, your latest letter to Washington asked, I think, the right question: coup or con? When it comes to what Trump is up to. And we'll get back to that. But let me stick, Peter, to you, both reflect not only on the past week, but also the seeming normality when you go to the Biden-Harris transition website, which is now the only place you can find out what's going on, and you have readouts of conversations with world leaders in the way that this used to be normal, and I guess it is normal once again. How do we, how does in this turmoil, how do you try to move forward to back to some sense of normalcy?
Well, I think you have to, try to bifurcate your brain in many ways, because yes, there is this, and I was saying this before we got on air, we had our 10 o'clock story conference with the Washington Bureau, and our bureau chief literally said, let me update you on our coup. And I was sitting there, I'm like, I cannot believe we're having this conversation with our Washington bureau chief. So you have to bifurcate your mind, because, unless something incredibly extra-constitutional happens, he will be president of the United States on January 20th. And I think, frankly, as a journalist, one of the nice things is you can engage on those serious policy issues, which we used to talk about with some regularity, Republican or Democratic presidents. And I think we have to start thinking about that. And I think on foreign policy in particular, it's going to be fascinating. And Ivo, you and I have talked about this before, but the thing I've been looking at very closely is I think there's an assumption in many quarters that a Biden administration is going to be a third term for Barack Obama. And having covered the White House in the early days of the Obama administration, I don't think that's true. I think there was a lot of tension between the Biden camp and the Obama camp. Biden comes from a much more sort of Dean Acheson, liberal internationalist, sort of tradition of the Democratic Party, almost a Harry Truman Democrat. And it's been interesting to see, you got Tony Blinken, who's his chief, foreign policy brain, has co-written a piece with Robert Kagan, who is sort of a neocon. It's interesting that Obama very much saw his foreign policy as almost a Kissingerian, interest. Again, to use the phrase that they use themselves, don't do stupid poop. Whereas Biden, one of his things he's written already is he wants to do a summit of the democracies, and this concept that the Democratic Party used to stand for, democratic promotion, democracy promotion, human rights abroad, and all that kind of was sort of tarred by Bush and the neocons using that in the war in Iraq, right? This was sort of democracy promotion at the point of a gun. And so no Democrat could sort of come up and say, I still believe in this stuff. And that actually to Obama, right? He was against the war. He was against the use of American influence abroad in that kind of way. And I think what we'll see with Biden is a return of that kind of foreign policy, that again, this Dean Acheson sense of the indispensable nation, that they should play a role in the world, be it in Turkey, be it in Hungary, be it in Thailand, some of these allies where we've seen democratic norms rolled back. I think Biden is going to make that a centerpiece of his foreign policy. And frankly, just to weave back to what Susan was talking about, the fact that Donald Trump is undermining the U.S. as an exemplar on those issues is going to make his job harder in that regard. And we always talk about this Joe Nye power. And one of the things you realize, I think, as Susan was alluding to, as a foreign correspondent, is much of what the U.S. is as a soft power is as an example. People, even Britain, when Giles, you know more about this than I do. I remember living in the UK, and the way they would set up their parliamentary select committee hearings, they always said, well, let's try to do it like the U.S. Senate. The U.S. as an example is a really powerful one. And the inability now to use the U.S. as an example, be it because of our inability to tackle COVID or because of what Trump is doing over the last week, is going to hurt Biden's ability to push that democracy promotion agenda, which clearly is at the core of what he wants to do in the next 4 years.
Giles, how does it look from across the pond? One way in which Boris Johnson is trying to mimic American institutions, just follow up on Peter, is to bring back the press briefing just at the moment that in the U.S. doesn't exist anymore, or at least hasn't for the last 4 years. I don't think we've had a real press briefing for a while. But aside from that, how does the turmoil both in Washington and in the country, and importantly, the return of Joe Biden, and in many ways it is a return. He's vice president who's been around for a long time, to the White House. How is that seen from across the Atlantic? And you're still muted, Giles. You're muted, Giles.
Thanks for having me. How is it seen? It's seen with a good deal of hope and enthusiasm still, I think. I'm really struck by Susan's description of, quote, a week for America, and for Peter's misgivings. We are aware, obviously, of the drama being played out in the White House, and it's dismaying. But I think not being quite so immersed in the details of that drama, we're not taking it quite so seriously. And perhaps there's just a lag, and we're still digesting the result of the election itself. And I just wanted to count 3 executive orders that we still assume Biden will sign very early in his term, at which we still assume he will begin next January, returning to the Paris Climate Accords, rejoining the WHO, restarting a process to get back with the Iran deal, all of which will have symbolic significance, but much more than that, really deep political significance instantly, even though they'll only be executive orders. So for those kinds of reasons, I think there's a great deal of optimism, except among the very small minority of political Britain that opposes those things. I would just say finally that the dismay, certainly personally, that I feel at the moment is not so much about the process that you're all going through to get Trump out of the White House, which I have no doubt will work in the end, though I'm very struck by the idea of reporting by the FT's Washington Bureau. It's more the fact that he's very likely to have continued gridlock in Washington, absent an electoral miracle in Georgia, and that he's very likely to be a one-term president. And so correct me if I'm wrong there, but widely thought that he probably wouldn't run for re-election, and that therefore lame duck status would kick in very soon. So his window of opportunity will be very short.
Susan, how do you see that? Two big political realities once the Trump drama is over, of the deadlock at home and the question of perhaps lame duck Biden, and the impact on ability to move the country forward, both domestically, but particularly in this for us, in foreign policy.
Well, yeah, just to quickly address that part, Giles, I think they are worried about that perception of lame duckness. And actually, you saw them this week explicitly saying, no, they don't rule out running for a second term, even though it's been widely expected that he would be a one-term president. And in part, I think it is exactly for that reason, especially looking at the constraints of divided government on the front end. They don't want to trade away right away this notion that Biden, or at least his team, will remain in power and in office for more than 4 years. So I think that's a concern out of the gate, although they're trying to address it, which is interesting to me. And he explicitly did not rule that out in the course of the campaign. People thought throughout that he might do so, but clearly it was better for him not to be to that political concession and not to have to trade it away in order to win the Democratic nomination. So at least he's not made an official commitment to that end. But more broadly, I think you're right to spotlight the problem of divided government and how much just better optics and better words from the president at this point are not going to be sufficient to reassure allies abroad or people here at home for 2 reasons. Number one, there is literally zero sign of any cooperation or any message receiving on the part of Republicans. There's message sending, you could argue, on the part of the electorate, but there is not message receiving. The bottom line is these are folks who have participated in, enabled, and cheered on mass collusion on a scale that Americans really have not seen, certainly since McCarthyism or segregationism in the United States. And that kind of toxicity has taken over one of America's political parties. And if you were under any illusions, I think for me, looking at the behavior of the Republicans on the beginning of this week, right? So President-elect Biden was declared the winner on Saturday, weekend of celebration in America's Democratic big cities. What are Republicans going to do Monday, Tuesday? You get the answer. The answer is to persist in the enabling and the delusions of a defeated propagandist in the White House. And so that is not a message that suggests that, this quote unquote good relationship between Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden is going to produce And the second reason that I would just quickly flag, of course, is that America's word has now been, I think, pretty permanently undermined in terms of its ability to conclude major international agreements. Because if the expectation is you can simply wait out an admission that you don't like and come up with a few years later that you do, you have zero incentive to deal with the United States. What is the point of making any future Iran deal, for example, if you understand that it could immediately be broken within months or years by a new party coming to power? And so I don't see how Joe Biden can fix that by simply telling the world we're back and hey, we're going to be good actors again.
Can I disagree with Susan a little bit on this, which is always, I know, a dangerous thing. Susan used to be my boss, so I always hate disagreeing with her. But the thing, I think, having covered politics not only in Washington but also in Brussels and other parts of the world, is you begin to realize how quickly power begins to seep from a losing candidate. And I think we are underestimating the power of the American presidency, particularly on the foreign stage. It's not just the use of the commander-in-chief in the military, but the power of the pulpit, the power of the the bully pulpit. And I think maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I do think what we will see is the ability of a president to force himself and force the agenda on a global order will reassert itself. Susan is right that there will be questioning by allies and foes alike about whether the American word can be taken at face value anymore, and whether in 4 years we'll have another Trump presidency. But I think we're underestimating the extent to which an American president with all the levers of power at his disposal on a foreign policy, again, the Biden government domestically is an issue, but on the international stage, I think is a very, very powerful thing. And I think we're going to be surprised at how quickly Donald Trump to a OANN or Newsmax kind of talking head, and that we'll be talking, as we did, what we are doing, frankly, about who's going to get cabinet secretaries, what the policy is going to be, what is the agenda of the Biden administration going to be. And I think we're going to be, as bad as this week has been and as bad as the next 6 weeks might be, I think we're going to be surprised at how quickly in January and February we are looking forward to what a bottom is going to do on a global stage.
Let me just quickly say, Peter, just for the record, I actually do agree with you on that, except with the caveat that when it comes to concluding international agreements, I really do feel that America's word has been undermined by the fact that we have this permanent division in our country, and we're so close to being a 50-50 nation.
Fair enough.
I think, as George W. Bush showed in 2000, once you're in the White House, govern as if you had a landslide. And he did, and it was extraordinarily effective. It helped to have 9/11 in order to sort of bring that to the fore, but he governed that way, and there's no reason to believe that Biden won't. But we're not there yet, Peter. Under our system of government, elections determine the eventual new winner. But it also means that we do have this system of government where presidents govern for 4 years, exactly for 4 years. And Donald Trump is president until 11:59 a.m. on January 20th, 2021. And he has extraordinary powers while doing so. One of those is to determine who serves in this administration. And Peter, as Susan said earlier on, we had this really, truly remarkable spectacle where the president fired, in fact, he terminated, was the word he used, Secretary Esper, the defense secretary, and started installing a whole variety of people in senior places in the Pentagon and the National Security Agency and the CIA. What is that all about? What do you think how should we read this?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, Ivo, you've written about this recently, and Susan's column, which just went up today, I think it's also must read on this topic. I mean, I think we're all trying to figure it out. And the Esper thing, if it was on its own, I think is understandable. They clearly had a falling out over any number of things. The fact that Esper disagreed with the deployment of guard units into D.C. or elsewhere to quell some of the Black Lives Matter protests, the fact that he was supportive of renaming some of these southern bases that are named after Confederate generals. There was a general falling out, and Trump publicly called him Yesper and all this kind of stuff. So if it had just been Esper, I think we would have said, all right, this is taking vengeance against an insubordinate, disloyal minion. But these are slightly troubling things of not only replacing other senior people in National Security Agency, within the Pentagon, but who he's replacing them with. These sort of Devin ex-staffers who are part of this whole conspiracy-minded, loyalist, almost QAnon in some ways group. Why would he put these people in these positions? And Susan does a very good in her column sort of summary the exact same thing I am hearing, which is, everything from, he's trying to preparing the ground for the Israelis to strike Iran, or he wants to quickly get the troops out of Afghanistan, or something more broadly policy-wise. I'm not a huge buyer of that theory, because if we know anything about Donald Trump, he doesn't care about policy. He cares about politics and survival. So I tend to focus on two of the other things, which again Susan writes about, which is, one, it is something to do about this thing he's about, which is Russia did not win the election 4 years ago. And there is apparently, classified intelligence reports that he thinks will reveal that. Anyone we have talked to have seen this stuff says that's not true, but he wants it out. And there's been a battle within the administration over whether that will reveal, sources and methods within the community. And there's push back on that. That tends to be the one I think is probably the most likely case. But there's also this issue of he just likes to take vengeance on people. And Susan, in her column, I think, again, the thing that resonates with me when I was talking to my old sources in the Pentagon, where I used to cover, is this issue of, we've seen Trump and we've seen this team for 4 years. As the Brits say, couldn't organize a piss up in a brewery, right? This is not a team that would be able to organize something more nefarious that A, wouldn't get out, or B, actually be executed. So I guess I am less worried about an actual coup, gosh, I can't even believe I'm saying this, than just sort of, a petty vengeance and trying to set himself up politically for 4 years from now. But again, to get back to the theme of undermining of American institutions and our image abroad. I mean, again, another thing you learn as a foreign correspondent is that he holds Americans to be almost like breathing air, which is, we trust our courts, we trust our law enforcement, we trust our institutions. Those things can disappear very, very quickly. And the example I have used in other forums is, if you look at France and Italy, two economies that are about the same size, if you go to France, people pay their taxes, they trust the courts, they trust their institutions. For all of France's problems, France functions. Italy does not, because the courts don't work. People don't pay their taxes. If you are Italian, talented Italian, they have brilliant universities. You end up going to the city of London or Brussels, because you can't actually, there's no meritocracy within the Italian system. And that is a failing state as a result of it. And you've seen this in other Southern European countries. I'll take one more reach on this topic, because I feel very passionately about it, having spent a lot of time writing about it. I spent a lot of time early in the war Iraq as a war correspondent, and writing a lot about how the good, the hopes of the American military and the government, good-natured people showing up in Baghdad, trying to rebuild the Iraqi government, both military and civilian. And what they ran into is a society that had been told, do not trust your leaders, do not trust your institution. The Americans coming in and saying, we're going to build you electric infrastructure, we're going to build you governance, we're going to train your troops. It didn't work. It was doomed to fail, because you have a society there that no longer trusted government institutions. Now, okay, we're not Iraq, and that's a failed state, and it's a bit of a reach. But my point is that these institutions, once they are undermined, the faith of the populace in those institutions can disappear very quickly and for a long time, for a generation. And I think that is the risk of what's going on now, is that the American people may stop trusting the institutions, and we may start going into the Italian route, in which we have a permanently dysfunctional state, which is the decline of the American century. I mean, that's really kind of what we're at.
Giles, comment on that. Is that a sense of fear that you hear about in London, and then also, in addition, talk a little bit about Boris Johnson and how he is navigating a very difficult situation. Of all the close American allies, Johnson was the closest to Donald Trump, and probably the furthest away both from Obama and from Biden. Macron tried to be close to Trump, didn't work very well, gave up on him. Abe was very close to Trump, but he's no longer there. Of course, Merkel had famously, from the very beginning, big differences with Trump, but Boris Johnson was very close and had some differences with Biden. How is he navigating this difficult situation for him as well?
Right. Well, let me first pick up on what Peter was saying and the risk of states failing. I don't think it's a reach at all. I fear it more in my own country than in yours. Just a small example. Johnson's government right now is trying to rebuild shattered public faith in his key decisions over containing COVID, all of which have, and the populace at large, are undecided as to the status of guidelines issued by this government. At the beginning, the assumption was that they were to be followed. Now, long story short, people make up their own minds. It's a small example, but it's not. So the only point I'm making is it's not just in Southern Europe and Iraq that institutions can unravel, and the public trust that is essential for their functioning unravels too. Coming back to Johnson and Biden, and if you want, I will continue at this point to talk about how Biden might affect the Brexit negotiation, which is right at the core of what he's doing. You're absolutely right. He ostensibly faced an awkward phone call with Biden, and there was a great deal of reporting to suggest that he'd be at the back of the queue for that. He wasn't. He was at the front of the queue, and there seems to have been a reason for that, and that is that Biden, who is anti-Brexit and more specifically identifies as Irish anti-Brexit, wanted to make it very clear he believed in the special relationship that we're also paranoid about over here. It seems to mean always much more to us than to you guys. I completely understand why, having worked into myself. But he wanted to make it very clear that if part of Johnson's post-Brexit vision was some kind of a trade deal with the US, well, he had to secure one with the EU first. And I cannot help thinking that although the process is very close to deadline now, this will alter the mood music and possibly even the outcome. There is this specific issue also of a bill before Parliament now, the Internal Market Bill, by which the government is giving itself permission to violate its withdrawal agreement with the EU in order to secure free movement of goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. It has, however, undertaken and signed a treaty promising to do that in order to ensure that there needn't be a hard border on the island of Ireland. If there is, then that would be a stark violation of the Good Friday Agreement, which, of course, the US has a great deal of political capital invested in from the time that George Mitchell helped secure it, and Biden has made very clear, both as a candidate and as president-elect, that would be a red line. And of course, final point, this week, two key Brexiteers have announced they're leaving Downing Street. We had a session here today in which a number of people who know more about the details of this than I do said, it doesn't make any difference. The Brexit process is on rails, and they'll come to a point between now and the end of the year when Johnson has to make a go, no-go decision. But all the details are sort of being worked out by the Sherpas right now. But I do think that the by-election has changed the context fundamentally. And personally, I'm more optimistic that we'll have a sensible as opposed to an unruly or a disastrous Brexit.
Ivo, if you wouldn't mind just me jumping in on this, having spent, what was it, news editor in London for 3 years during the whole Brexit phenomenon, I have some thoughts on this, because I do think Giles is right, that I think even if you look at domestic American politics, it has always been, for lack of a better word, pro-Irish, right? Biden very much identifies as pro-Irish, and the issue of the Good Friday Agreement is one of those things that does motivate a decent number of members of Congress who view themselves as Irish American themselves, but also have constituencies that make this issue. So there's already going to be a natural tendency in the U.S. to side with Ireland, and by Ireland, the EU, in these negotiations. And I think this is going to have longer term implications for American foreign policy on Europe, because traditionally for centuries, well, at least since 1812, when the US looked to Europe to deal with foreign policy, it was a special relationship. It was Britain that we turned to first. But I think we've already seen on Ukraine and the conflict there, the US turned to Germany, the U.S. turned to Poland. Britain was not even involved in the European strategy to deal with the Russian intervention in Ukraine. And I think what you're gradually going to see is that, particularly with Biden, because I think there was some sort of, Trumpian, he's got golf courses in Scotland. His mother was Scottish. There was sort of a holdover sort of pro-Britishness that he expressed with Nigel Farage and that. I think Biden in many ways exemplifies shifting thinking about how you approach Europe that is much more German focused, much more EU focused. Remember, he's the senior American official to actually speak to the European Parliament. And I think we're going to gradually see US foreign policy when it comes to Europe engaging far more with Germany and with the bigger economic powers on the continent. And I think the Brexit dispute, which is going to become in many ways an Anglo-Irish dispute, will help speed that along, and I think Biden will speed that along as well.
So I think, Susan, that sort of both observations and Biden being more European, rather less devoted to the special relationship, and secondly, and I think importantly, that the election plus a phone call actually can have profound impact on the direction of policy making in number 10, as Giles seems to see. So that in some ways, the United States to help steer what happens in this part of the world is real just by the fact that Biden won the election and makes a phone call. How do we think about that?
I think that is, I agree with everything that's been said. Biden is definitely, Peter said identifiers. That's true. And I think these are good observations, although I would be a little bit sanguine about the extent to which President Biden is really going to be able or have the luxury of focusing on transatlantic issues or, the quote unquote special relations. I think certainly his instincts and heart, he spent 37 years, or more here in Washington. So, those default settings will be hard to destroy. But the bottom line is, the real foreign policy conversation and debate here in Washington revolves around and largely set by Trump, but also predating him, which is the question of what to do about China and to a lesser extent about Russia, and the idea that the previous US policy that essentially obtained for the last several decades, which was the notion applied in different ways that both China and Russia could be, in fact, responsible stakeholders of the international order. That has been debunked in both cases and with different consequences, but you really hear something very different from Biden's advisors now than you did 4 years ago when they served in the Obama administration together about China and about what the US policy is. And I find it very notable that Biden explicitly did not commit to rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the signature Obama administration effort to actually execute on its called pivot to Asia. And the idea was essentially to create an economic response to China as opposed to purely a security one, and to have it be done in concert with other Pacific powers. What is US policy at this point without that? And with the incoming Biden administration essentially saying our old policy, meaning the Obama administration's, and we don't like the Trump policy. Okay, well, what does that mean? And I have to say that I really don't know. And that I think is going to be very quickly a very consuming issue here in Washington that's far more likely to predominate. I'm also frankly worried, we haven't talked about, because we've talked understandably a lot about what's happening domestically here inside the US. There is a long previous history of bad actors on the world stage taking advantage of American transitions. And I also remember the transition from George W. Bush to Barack Obama. In addition to the global economic crisis that the new administration had to deal with, there was a little war that broke out as Israel creates some new facts on the ground. And I just feel that we have none of us, not this conversation per se, but just in general, the foreign policy conversation, really not reckoned with, well, what is going to happen in the world? Look at how we just had a war breakout in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the U.S. completely absent from that conversation, and a humiliating defeat was just accepted by the Armenians. How long will that stick? And again, that might not be the biggest geopolitical flashpoint, but what about something happening in a place that is more consequential?
There is also this evidence that the transition to Bush was when the September 11th plotters were working. So I think that's a good point. I couldn't agree with you more, Susan. I just want to put one caveat to this. Clearly, China will be front and center Paris. There is no doubt that this is the greatest foreign policy challenge facing the Biden administration. But the one thing I will just say is, and this faced Obama when he came in and the whole pivot for Asia, he said, we are a Pacific nation, the Pacific century. We want to look, to the West, and this is in our interest. And then crisis happens, right? Libya happens. And Ivo knows better than I do. When crisis happens, you suddenly look, who can help me? And inevitably, it's Europe. Inevitably, it is your like-minded allies who have deployable forces, that have diplomatic ties. And so I wouldn't Europe down too much. Maybe it's because of the institution I work for. I think there is a sense that although there are overriding foreign policy issues that are going to be tackled, and China is that, to these flare-ups, these wars, terrorist attacks, whatever it is, inevitably, it is the Europeans, it is NATO, it is that is the place where presidents tend to go and get help on the stage. And I think the importance of reestablishing or reinvigorating some of those alliances is going to be pretty important, because the one thing we have that China doesn't have is allies, and not just in Europe, but it's Japan as a treaty ally, Korea as a treaty ally, Australia as a treaty ally, and we have to reinvigorate those alliances, because that is actually what our leverage is on the international stage.
I mean, I think both of you are right in an important way, and the question is it enough? Because one of the criticisms, of course, of the last 4 years is that Trump's bilateral transactional approach, working with bad guys to try to get deals, and not with allies, and allowing China and Russia to emerge, or allowing is the wrong word, seeing Russia and China emerging as people who are no longer care to even pretend that they have a stake in the international order. There's this massive vacuum in which all kinds of things happen. And Susan mentioned Libya, lots of things have been happening, and other players are starting to push their way in. Turkey being, of course, a prime example over the last 4 years. And you have this disorder that is out there. Even if Biden tried to band together, the band of allies together, the reality, Giles, it seems to me, is this is a really complex and empty lot in which everybody is going to maneuver for advantage. And the idea that the United States is going to shape that order just because it used to do that, now that we have a president who believes in that, Actionsonian, as Peter put it in the first place, strikes me as optimistic or perhaps a little far-fetched. How do you think about it, Giles?
I think you're right. It's suddenly much more complex. You'll recall 4 years ago, complex as a result of sins of omission over the past 4 years. 4 years ago, Obama made it simple for Trump by saying, Mr. President, you have one overriding foreign policy priority, and that is to avoid a nuclear exchange with North Korea. And Trump actually took that seriously. He responded in an eccentric way. But I wonder, there is nobody to deliver a message of similar authority, or let alone simplicity, to Biden. I mean, clearly, as Peter was saying, the big issue is the relationship with China. But I wonder within that, what they regard as the potential flashpoint. And I always, come back to Taiwan. I'd be really curious, actually, to know whether that is regarded as just one of a whole basket of China-related issues by Peter and Susan and you, Ivo, or whether, in fact, the rhetoric from both sides, both Taipei and Beijing, and the spectacle of the US paying intermittent attention to give the Trump administration its due, perhaps paying more attention than the rest of the West. Are we sleepwalking towards an actual hot conflict there?
I would shift your eyes a little bit to the east, to be perfectly blunt with you, and Hong Kong, because I think again, if you go with my premise that Biden is a much more traditional values-based, we have to project American values abroad, particularly democracy. There is one place that the Chinese have abused democratic principles, and that's in Hong Kong. And Trump has said, I don't care. And he said, I don't care because he wants to get a trade deal. Does an Obama administration come in and say, okay, guys, you have to stop abusing? And frankly, a lot of our news organizations have seen this firsthand because a lot of us have our Asia headquarters in Hong Kong. We've really had to change the way we operate in Hong Kong now because it's no longer a free and democratic society. Does the Biden administration say this but no further? I think there's a bigger chance of, I don't know if I'll say hot war, but real tension, conflict over Hong Kong, frankly, at this point, than there's always going to be tensions over Taiwan. The U.S. is always going to show that it can, send an aircraft carrier through the straits, the Taiwan Straits. But I do think, in terms of if we're trying to figure out what is the flashpoint that comes in them two after the inauguration day, I would watch much more Hong Kong, because I think if Biden is true to his values-based foreign policy, he's going to have to do something very principled on Hong Kong that the Trump administration hasn't.
In many ways, Susan, it may not be an either or, it may be both, because of course Taiwan is also a functioning democracy. And the kind of tension that we are seeing over the issue of Taiwan, just as the Hong Kong issue is blowing up. By the way, they shut down the Democratic legislature yesterday. It's not nothing what the Chinese have been doing on that front. This may well be the crisis that you were talking about. Is coming forward that people aren't paying attention to, and will put the new administration into a pickle of how to deal with it.
Yeah, Ivo, actually, that is something that's been on my mind this week. And I think that, again, establishing new facts on the ground, that's what I would look for with a lot of these governments. And it's not an accident that came at the time that China, which had been holding out, decided to recognize Biden's election and call him the president-elect overnight. That came within days of this move in Hong Kong. I think they're related. And Peter, I'm definitely with you. That was my prediction. Actually, we did a New Yorker kind of instead of a conventional endorsement of Biden, in which we looked at different areas. And I wrote the foreign policy piece, and that was my prediction, was that Biden would be a much more human rights and values oriented foreign policy practitioner than Obama was. So I'm with you, and I think it's worrisome. I think that Trump has reduced the number of tools that are available because he's so destroyed the credibility of the United States. So this is a very anxiety-ridden time. But in the meantime, Ivo, here I am in Minsk on the Potomac. Wish us luck this weekend when the Proud Boys come to march.
Well, we will, and if there's a foreign policy angle to it, we'll be discussing it. You, Susan Glasser of the New Yorker, Peter Spiegel of the Financial Times, Giles Whittell of Tortoise Media. Thank you so much all for joining us, and have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks, Ivo.
Thank you so much. Great to see everyone.